Koinaka, hello, olegata, talafalava, malo lele, and greetings from the Pacific. Welcome to our Morning Star, an exhibition commemorating 60 years of resistance, unity, struggles, and our quest for freedom and independence for West Papua. I'm Mereoni from Fiji, and I'm honored to have the Honorable Ralph Regenvanu of Vanuatu join me as a guest on this exhibition interview. Ralph is a Ni Vanuatu anthropologist, artist, and politician. He has been a member of Parliament since 2008 and is currently the opposition leader of the Vanuatu Parliament. Welcome, Ralph.
Thank you for having me.
So Ralph, you have been an active voice for West Papua and other Pacific struggles for decades. Even before your political career, you've been a staunch supporter of West Papua. Can you share with me a bit about your earliest engagements or involvement in your activism for West Papua? How did you get involved?
Well, I am a child of the political independence of Vanuatu. So I was a young child going to primary school when Vanuatu was still a colony. It was the New Hebrides. And my parents were key figures in the fight for political freedom. And so I saw that firsthand. We were even, taken away from the home at night to hide from people who were potentially trying to harm my father or mother and the family. So I was there with those, as a child, observing the leaders of our political independence movement, including the leader of the movement, who was the late Father Walter Lini. And around the time we gained independence was when I learned about West Papua. Our leaders were talking about all the Pacific Island states that had not achieved political independence yet. Kanaki, West Papua, Tahiti Nui, others. And there was a sense of solidarity that had been built up between these political leaders in their international campaign for decolonization of their various territories. And so when Vanuatu became independent, there was a real thinking that we have to help these people who have been with us in this struggle up to now, and now we've got our independence. What about them? And I remember the convening of the first nuclear-free independent Pacific movement meeting in Port Vila, where I was living, early after independence, in the first few years after independence, and the people who came to that meeting. And I think that was where I developed my consciousness about the need for political independence being the ultimate self-determination for a people in the current international context. And so we watched our leaders standing up with West Papua ever since independence, consistently. And it got to a point where around the year 2000, or just after the year 2000, a government came in that seemed to be not so committed to the cause of the decolonization, independence of West Papua. And it was at that point that all of us from that generation decided that we need to maintain this lobby on our government and ensure that we never lose this focus. And so I was one of the founding members of the Vanuatu Free West Papua Association at that time. And interestingly, all the other members were of our same generation and younger. And that really involved me explicitly in this campaign. And then since then, I've been able to use my position as a member of Parliament and at one time Minister of Foreign Affairs to further push that agenda. But it really all came from that experience of the decolonization of my own country, which I lived through.
It's wonderful to hear, and the ongoing solidarity and witnessing your parents fight that and continuing that same spirit for political independence and lending yourself to the region and others in the region. This year commemorates 60 years of when the Morning Star flag was first raised in West Papua. Since then, there have been forced migration of West Papuans. Many are living in exile. Thousands have been murdered, women raped, families broken. In other words, this year marks 60 years of Indonesia's colonization of West Papua, with sustained human rights abuses and violence against Papuans. This is happening in our very home in the Pacific, with generations of injustice endured. What is your view of the plight of our West Papuan brothers and sisters and Indonesia's occupancy today?
Well, what happened 60 years ago was a great betrayal of everything the international world order stands for. A great betrayal by the United Nations and the major countries, the members of the Security Council, of a people's right to self-determination. And it's when you understand the details of the history of what happened at that time, it makes it even more apparent that it was just a great betrayal of a people for, superpower rivalry of the Cold War, sacrificed an entire nation. And ever since then, that injustice continues to be perpetuated and increased and expanded. And as you say, now it's become an intergenerational thing. So we have generations of West Papuans who, because of their right to self-determination was denied 60 years ago, have continued to suffer. And we have a territory, if you put aside the human population, the resources are just being raped. Some of the worst deforestation in the world at this present time, where we're trying to talk about the climate crisis and the need to stop emissions. The biggest gold mine in the world, of course, that's what's at the center of this colonization by Indonesia. And as the cries of the people become more heard in the international community, increasing repression right now as we're speaking, just a big clampdown on this decolonization movement, this independence movement, that's going on right now in West Papua. And another tragic feature of this history is the continued deliberate ignorance of what's happening by the neighbors in the Pacific, Australia, in near Asia. Everyone knows this is going on. This massive human rights violations, this massive denial of people's right to self-determination, and everyone is being quiet on the issue. It's at some points, it seems there was only a few countries, and Vanuatu has been one of the consistent ones that continually raise it. And other countries that know what's going on. Australia is a good example. The nearest neighbor knows very well what's going on, and yet continue to turn a blind eye and also support the Indonesian state in the repression that's going on. And so it's very sad when you think about that history. And we're very much hoping that the increasing repression now and the increasing international profile of West Papua is something that is leading to something that will change the lives of the people of West Papua for the better. And that's something that we have to keep in mind as a goal that we all strive towards.
And just going back to what you mentioned about, it's happened, the neighbors are witnessing this, the countries all around them are witnessing this and knowing that it's going on and turning a blind eye. For us in the Pacific, it's us. We are seeing it, feeling it, and we have shared history and we are journeying with them. So that brings me to the question about how we in the Pacific, our leaders, our governments are reacting to. For Pacific regionalism, the issue of West Papua's right to self-determination and concerns for Indonesia's human rights abuses and violations of Papuans have been an agenda for the Pacific. Since 2000, West Papua featured on our Pacific Leaders agenda. the Pacific it needs to better its approach to addressing West Papua. So how can we, the region, the Pacific Islanders and our leaders, resolve and address together the issues faced by West Papua? And what's holding us back from taking more of a much needed stand to support West Papua's right to self-determination?
The Pacific Island Forum leaders back in 2019 made a very strategic request at the forum for the human rights situation in West Papua to be examined by the UN Human Rights Commissioner, for there to be an informed, evidence-based report on the human rights situation in West Papua. That request was made, that appeal was made to Indonesia and to the UN Human Rights Commissioner. And what's happened is it's been ignored to date. It was a specific time-limited request that has to be done by, the report has to be presented in 2020. And I think what has happened is the fact that it has not happened, it calls the credibility of the Pacific Island Forum into question. This specific request has not been met. What is the legitimacy of the Pacific Islands Forum that made this specific appeal? Why a country is continuing to maintain cordial relations with Indonesia when Indonesia is not responding to this call from the region? I think the human rights focus is the right focus. We have to maintain the self-determination focus, but the human rights focus is something we can get countries on board with. And we have seen the group of Asia, Africa, Caribbean, Pacific, the ACP group, consisting of 79 sovereign states, including the Pacific states, but also the African Caribbean states, also supporting the Pacific Island Forum leaders' position. And at the same time, we've seen, in an opposite direction to the request, the human rights situation in West Papua rapidly deteriorating since that time. Directly related to this request, actually, this push. And so I think the Pacific Island Forum leaders need to think about what their legitimacy as leaders is when they request of their diplomatic partners to take certain actions and it doesn't happen, and the United Nations doesn't respond either. We need better leadership on the issue of West Papua in the Pacific. The Melanesian Spearhead Group countries, there's a unique opportunity unfolding right now to allow West Papua to become a member of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which will greatly elevate their ability to dialogue with the Indonesian state and also with other Pacific Island countries, specifically the Melanesian countries as well. We now have, for the last 5 years or 6 years, we finally have a united liberation movement behind the ULMWP, the United Liberation Movement of West Papua, which has the mandate and legitimacy to speak on behalf of the West Papuan people. That's never happened before. So this is the right time in history for countries to use diplomatic strategies to force the human rights situation to be addressed. And the start of that is, of course, this report that we're asking for. There's too much misinformation being peddled around the place. So we need an independent assessment of that human rights situation, which is what the Pacific Island leaders asked for. It's 2 years ago now. It's what the African Caribbean Pacific group have asked for, which is now 2 years overdue. And if it doesn't happen, and it's not happening, the Pacific Island leaders need to say, what is the next step? What do we do now? And I think we're in a unique opportunity also at this particular point in time where there's a Pacific Island state that heads the Human Rights Council, and there is a second Pacific Island state in the Human Rights Council. So this is an unprecedented situation where the Pacific is represented at the level of the United Nations Human Rights Council. So all the balls are lined up at the moment for the Pacific to really make some decisive strategic moves. And it requires a lot of courage, because if Indonesia does not and continues to refuse to allow the visit of the UN Human Rights Commissioner, despite calls from all around the world, despite calls from inside West Papua by the West Papuan Council of Churches, despite calls from within Indonesian civil society, it has to be elevated to the next level. And that's something which our leaders have to decide. What is the next level? Where do we go from here? Because at a diplomatic level, we've done what we can do. We continue to push the issue. If nothing happens, there needs to be a next level to go to, and that's something that needs to be considered now.
Thank you, Ralph, for that response. Unfortunately, we've reached our time, and I just would like to ask, just reflecting on some of the points that you have shared about, when we're commemorating the 60 years of raising the Morning Star flag, what you said at the beginning about it being the great betrayal has really resonated with me, and would ask if you'd like to share any final comments or any particular message or call to leaders to take up this call, and the leadership that you said that we need at this time. If you'd like to share a final comment on that.
I think as I said, we're in a very strategic time for West Papua, for the struggle for self-determination. Self-determination is still happening in the Pacific. We're seeing, the Kanaki, the issue of the self-determination of Kanaki is right on the agenda. Bougainville. West Papua needs to be there in that same space, and it's going to need help from the Pacific Island states. And the Pacific Island states need to step up right now to do it. There needs to be some concerted diplomacy at the level of the United Nations, as well as within the region. Within Vanuatu, some important steps have been taken. Just last year, for example, the province of Shefa, which is the province where the main capital, Port Vila, is located, officially adopted West Papua as its territory or country of sister country, like other provinces in Vanuatu have adopted other countries in the Pacific. And on the 1st of December, they will be organizing the flag raising. So we have the provincial government taking charge of the West Papua liberation struggle and making sure that in Vanuatu, that support continues to grow. Governments never abandon the issue, but continue to push it. And that's something which I feel hopeful about. I think this West Papua issue is becoming more and more known to people all over the world. And if you see what happened in Timor-Leste, this is what happened. This is what happened. People began to know about it everywhere in the world. Movements started to grow up in all countries of the world. And at the end, despite Indonesia not wanting at all for Timor-Leste to become independent, it became independent. And so we have to redouble our efforts, and I think we could be getting there.
Thank you very much for being part of this exhibition interview, and all your work and your advocacy and your support, and also creating awareness, especially for young Pacific Islanders, to continue this journey and this fight with you. Thank you for your leadership and support, ongoing support for West Papua. Vinaka and Tageo Tomas.